Well, welcome back, everybody. This is part 4, and I'm going to conclude in this part, and we're going to think about the status of social theory today. Now, the intention of this part is not to give you a tour of contemporary social theory. That is really what the rest of the course is going to do. So as you go through the content each week, you will be introduced to a very, very wide range of contemporary scholars and thinkers in sociology. What I really want to think about here is just the relationship between classical theory and contemporary theory. And I suppose the question to start with is just the question of, why are we looking at classical theory? If you were to do a course in biology, for example, the week 2 lecture is probably not going to be on Victorian era biology. They're just going to jump you into contemporary understandings and theories. So why are we in sociology thinking so much about the past? Well, I think that's part of our nature as a discipline. Right? We understand as sociologists that who we are as people and what we have as a society is deeply influenced by history, right? The history of human civilization and human culture. Right? I love reading history and interpreting history because it tells me more about who I am as a person and why I believe what I believe and want the things that I want. And I think studying the history of sociology is important because it helps you understand why this discipline is the way that it is. Why do we have the major concerns that we have, the perspectives that we have? Why do we orient ourselves to the world in a certain way? Without understanding something about the history of this discipline, you cannot understand that. I also think one of the great benefits of sociology, it's a challenge, but it's also a joy in a way, is that it's a very young discipline. It's only been around for about 150 years. So it actually is possible to really directly engage with many of the texts that form the foundation of our field, and to see, by studying the history of these texts, how that field has developed. So we do like our classical theorists, we are interested in our classical theorists. We are not overly deferential to those theorists. Right? There are plenty of critiques out there of Marx, of Weber, of Durkheim, and hopefully all of you as students will be able to engage with those critiques as we work through this week's content. I will say though that many of their ideas, the ideas of Marx, Weber, Durkheim, even Spencer and Comte, many of them are still very popular. Almost every week I read a paper that uses some kind of concept from these theorists. It might be Marx's concept of exploitation, Weber's concept of rationalization, Durkheim's concept of solidarity. Right? These things are still really influential in the discipline, and so you have to learn and understand these theories to be conversant with the world of contemporary sociology. I briefly want to talk about each of these figures and how their perspectives, their questions, their understandings have filtered into the way that contemporary theorists might think. Let's start by talking about Marx. In last week's content, Steve introduced you to the difference between conflict theory, functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. And we think of these as 3 very broad perspectives that sociologists might take when looking at the world. Different hats we might put on when trying to understand social phenomenon. And I think each of these theorists can be mapped onto one of these different perspectives. Marx, for example, gives us a great example of a conflict perspective. So what is a conflict perspective? Remember that conflict theories, when they analyze social phenomenon, they're interested in how they relate to certain conflicts in society. So when you ask a conflict theorist, why are societies organized the way they are? The answer is almost always going to be that societies are organized the way they are because it benefits certain groups at the expense of others. Now we know that Marx was very much focused on class conflict, but today there are many, many other forms of conflict theory that have been inspired by Marx's approach, but have taken his concepts and applied them to different domains. No longer just looking at economics. Right? Feminist theory has looked at conflict between men and women. Critical race theory has looked at how different racial groups might have power and priority over others. Queer theory has looked at how heterosexuals have certain forms of power and institutional status above homosexuals or other kinds of sexualities. Critical disability theory has looked at how able-bodied people might have certain forms of power above those who are disabled. And increasingly we see theories that are interested in intersectionality, the relationship between these different kind of conflict domains. All of these different theoretical perspectives are examples of conflict theory because they're interested in how social phenomena are influenced by conflict between groups. Again, if you ask them, why are societies organized the way they are? If you ask, for example, a feminist theorist, why is marriage a feature of almost every human society? Every human society has something which looks like marriage. Why? A feminist theorist will say, because marriage helps men maintain their power over women. Right? Their explanations rely on an understanding of social conflict. Let me give you an example of how Marx's ideas have filtered directly into the work of a contemporary theorist. In the future weeks, you're going to read about the work of the Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell. And Raewyn Connell follows Marx in trying to develop tools for understanding how hierarchies of power are perpetuated. She takes up this idea of ideology, for example. Remember, ideology, the idea that ideas can justify inequalities. And she applies that to gender and sex. She'll look at how certain ideas about masculinity help men to maintain their power and status over women. And you'll see more about this in the week on gender and sexuality. She's also looked at race, racial inequalities, and geographic inequalities. Like today, for example, we've talked about the history of sociology. That is the history of thinkers in England, Germany, and France. What about the rest of the world? What about all of these scholars and contributions that are made from the global south? Raewyn Connell is someone who said, well, the reason we focus so much on European thinkers is not because they're the best thinkers, but because they have the most power, prestige, and status in the global institutional system. And she's tried to challenge this by looking at ideas of Southern theory, right? Theories from the global south. You'll be looking at some of those next week. But what about Durkheim? Durkheim's not really coming from a conflict perspective. He's instead coming from what we call the functionalist perspective. Again, I talked about this a bit in the last part, but let me reiterate. A functionalist theorist looks at society the same way you might look at a human body. Right? We're interested in the various parts of the human body. How does the heart help us to survive? How does the liver or the gallbladder, what contribution do these organs make to sustaining the existence of the individual body? A functionalist does the same thing for society. They say, what keeps societies integrated together? What keeps them alive, so to speak? What prevents them from collapsing? So if you ask a functionalist, why do people get married? They're not going to give you the feminist argument that it's about power and inequality. They'll probably say, oh, it's about child rearing. Marriage gives a stable arrangement for the rearing of children and the socialization of the next generation, which is essential for the ongoing perpetuation of society. Now, this perspective is a bit less common in sociology today. We see lots of debate about functionalism. It was very popular in early sociology, in Spencer, in Durkheim, etc. In the mid-century, it was very popular as well, and you'll hear in coming weeks about figures like Talcott Parsons, who are very functionalist in orientation. One of the challenges that arose with functionalism is it became very hard to detach from political concerns. It's not actually very easy to say that something is good for society or healthy for society, because people disagree on what the ideal society is. Something that I think is good for society, you might think is bad for society, because we might have vastly different ideas about what actually is an ideal society. Right? This was a big problem for functionalism. There are many other problems as well. Societies are not like organisms. They don't die, for example. They don't have skins. They don't have boundaries. It's very easy to see when an organism is died. It's very hard to see when a society has collapsed. Right? Societies can have all kinds of states of disintegration, but there's no hard line like death. So I won't get too much into this, but there's a whole bunch of reasons why functionalism was challenged. But I still think many sociologists are interested in quasi-functionalist questions. Right? They're interested in what keeps societies together. They're interested in what prevents social conflict. They also might be interested in specific institutions, like a marriage, for example. Right? There is a whole domain of sociology that focuses on the sociology of the family. And one really interesting question there is like, why do some families succeed and others don't? Why do some marriages stay together and other marriages don't? Like, what are the features of a marriage that might lead to long-term success? You can ask that about marriages. You can ask it about organizations, right? Universities, businesses, factory, whatever you want. There's all these different institutions, and you can focus on what preserves them and what perpetuates them. Right? So there is room for this kind of Durkheimian functionalist position, even though it is a bit less common today. One good example of a contemporary theorist who was interested in Durkheimian questions is Robert Balla. And you will read about Robert Balla in future weeks. And Balla came up with a concept of civil religion. A very interesting concept. Like Durkheim, Balla was very interested in what holds various members of societies together. How can shared values prevent societies from disintegrating? And what Balla was interested in is, well, religion is no longer there for us. Like perhaps in earlier societies, religion helped tie people together, but we no longer share a common religion. So what do we share? Well, Bella thought we shared what he called a civil religion. And I've already talked about this in a way. A civil religion is a shared understanding about things like human rights, democracy, the treatment of the individual, equality, what is fair for the individual. Like, we do seem to share in, say, modern Australia, a set of ideas about generally what is right and wrong. And Balla called this a civil religion, and he was interested in how civil religions worked to integrate societies. His work was also interested in threats to civil religion. Right? He was interested in democracy, liberalism, right, civil society, and he was very concerned, like Durkheim was, about individualization. And individualization is a process by which we become more unique and distinct as individuals. So, for example, my music taste will be very different from your music taste. Right? My beliefs and practices, maybe my religion, could be very different from yours. And as we become more individual, that question keeps arising of, well, what holds us together? What prevents, say, civil conflict or civil war? Why do we not just completely fragment from one another? A civil religion can provide that, but it can only withstand so much individualization. As we become more different, maybe even the civil religion can no longer hold us together. This was Balla's key question. It's a fascinating question, and you will read about it in coming weeks. Well, let's think about Weber as well. So we've talked about conflict theory, functionalism, symbolic interactionism is the last piece of that puzzle. And I think Weber has been very influential in influencing the interactionist perspective. Remember, the interactionist is less concerned with the question of why do people do what they do? Why do societies hang together? They're more interested in the how questions. Right? How do human beings relate to one another? How do we construct our worlds? How do we find meaning in the world? And this was really a lot of what Weber was interested in as well. Right? He was really focused on action and the meanings we attribute to various kinds of human action. Today we have a whole tradition of sociology that starts from the point of view of the actor. They're not focused on structures and systems, what we call macro sociology, right? These kind of big things that are going on at the level of human societies. They're more focused on the individual, their beliefs, their perspectives, their ideas, and they're more interested in this Weberian idea of Verstehen, understanding. Right? That is their goal, to understand how the individual sees the world and how that motivates and drives their action. So interactionists generally are using methods that allow the individual to speak for themselves. Rather than doing surveys, for example, they might be doing focus groups or interviews. Right? We have this whole tradition of sociology that is more interested in that kind of thing, and it's been hugely influenced by the work of Max Weber. As an example, I think about some contemporary feminist theory. So here I've got a picture of Patricia Hill Collins, and she wrote a very famous work in 1990 called Black Feminist Theory. And this is something you'll read about again in future weeks. Collins was a big contributor to a theory in sociology known as standpoint theory. And standpoint theory argues that rather than focusing on some hard objective truth about the world, we should consider how our perspectives on the world are influenced by our social position. Standpoint theory was really influential in challenging the dominance of certain groups in sociology. Right? They argued that we need diversity in sociology, that we need a wide variety of perspectives, right? Individuals from different class backgrounds or racial backgrounds or sex categories, because these categories gave us a very unique position on the world. So they were really focused again on how different groups perceived social phenomenon. And they believed that the perspective of marginalized groups should be placed at the forefront. That we could really learn something by focusing on the specific and unique experiences of those who face social oppression. You can see Hill Collins here is combining aspects of conflict theory and interactionist theory. Right? She is focused on individuals and groups and the meanings they attribute to social phenomenon, but she's looking at how those meanings can be a form of stratification, can reinforce stratification or can be related to stratification in some ways. Again, that might be confusing to you now, but I'm just saying look out in future weeks for the work of Hill Collins and think about how it might speak to this Weberian idea that our goal is to understand other points of view rather than simply develop some abstract propositions about the way the world works. Now, one last thing I wanted to say is that it is very useful to think about theorists as symbolic interactionists, conflict theorists, functionalist theorists, but don't be too obsessed with these categories. And don't feel like you have to take every social theorist and put them in one of those three boxes. Functionalism, conflict theory, these are not one theory. They're broad orientations that sociologists might take. Again, you might ask me a question about marriage, and I might say, what would a conflict theorist think about that? What would a functionalist think about that? What would an interactionist think about that? They're different hats that you can put on and try out. And even within these groups, there are vast differences. Within conflict theories, there are some focused on class, some on race, some on gender, some on intersectionality. Right? Some functionalists are focused on broad evolutionary forces across human societies. Some are just focused on businesses and how some businesses can succeed while others fail. So there are big differences between these groups, and I've said on my slide, think of them as general categories. Different alternatives that you can start using to think through sociological questions. One of the things that I really want you to get from this lecture is the idea that theory is not some complicated, abstract thing. It's something that we all do in our everyday life. If I ask you a simple question, if I ask you the question, why do men and women generally choose different kinds of occupations? Why are there more women in nursing and more men in engineering? That is a question about the social world. You will already have theories in your mind. You will have ways of thinking through those questions. Everybody in the world is a social theorist. To the extent that they reflect and think about human societies, they are a social theorist, right? All the theories that I'm talking about today give you, and all the theories that you learn in the course will give you, is a more sophisticated language for thinking through those kind of questions. Perhaps they'll expose you to ideas you haven't thought about before. But don't think of this as all that different from the things you are doing already as an engaged citizen in the world. Think as well, don't become too wedded to one theoretical perspective. Today, the best theorists usually combine aspects of multiple different theories. They learn from different theorists of the past, they acknowledge the changes that have gone on in the present, and they combine ideas to develop a holistic, sophisticated, nuanced understanding of the social world. I think one great figure in this tradition is Pierre Bourdieu, and you'll learn about Pierre Bourdieu when you do your week on class. Bourdieu is a theorist of class domination. He is deeply concerned about the relationship between classes and how some classes maintain power over others. This sounds like Marx, right? So is Bourdieu just taking from Marx? No. He also brings in Weberian elements, because he argues that class is not just an economic category. It's not just that the more wealth you have, the more power you have. It also depends upon what Bourdieu terms cultural capital, your tastes, your habits, right? Kind of things you own, the way you carry yourself. All that is important for Bourdieu. Bourdieu is interested, like Weber, in status and the relationship of status and class. So he's taking something from both the Weberian and the Marxist tradition. But Bourdieu is also taking something from Durkheim. As you'll see in the week on Bourdieu, Bourdieu is really interested in how society determines human behavior. And Bourdieu thinks that most of our behavior is deeply influenced by the society in which we are raised. The things we like, the people we love, the kind of things we find appealing, enjoyable, arousing, the kind of holidays we take, the kind of foods we eat, the substances we drink, the drugs we take, all of this for Bourdieu is deeply influenced by our social environment and our social upbringing. Where is that idea coming from? It's coming from Durkheim. It's coming from Durkheim's fundamental belief that the individual is a product of the social structure around them. Now you can disagree with Bourdieu on that, but you can see where those ideas have come from. Right? And I think Bourdieu is a great example of a theorist who blends these different theoretical traditions to make really solid, fascinating, interesting, useful arguments about contemporary societies. And I'm sure you will love reading about the work of Bourdieu in later weeks. All right, I have said a lot today. There is a lot of content today. Don't be alarmed or concerned if some of it has gone over your head. It's my job to try to convey this to you in an effective way. But I want you to remember as well that the textbook is there. Every single concept I've talked about today, anomie, rationalization, class, exploitation, this is also discussed in the textbook. You can also look at the glossary of the textbook to give you pretty systematic explanations of these kind of things. And remember as well to discuss these ideas. Do you remember what I said at the very beginning? Right, to engage in the process of theory is to become a participant in an ongoing human conversation that stretches right back to the very earliest parts of human history. And in teaching you theory, in helping you become conversant in the language of theory, I don't just want you to be listening to what other people have said. I want you to be a contributor. I want you to think about these ideas. Which one of them do you like? Are there concepts here that help you make sense of the world? Are there things that you vehemently disagree with in what these theorists have said? Become part of the conversation. Right? That is our duty to the generations, to continue this conversation on and to become members of this conversation going forward, to keep pushing that conversation forward into the future. This is why I want you to engage with theory. It's why I also want you to explore theory. Right, in this course, we're giving you a taste of many different theoretical traditions. Today, we've mostly talked about Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, but these are just three figures in an immense, rich history of social thought. Right? Try to understand it, try to engage with it. It's something that even if you're not a sociologist, I think it's part of being a good citizen and part of your development as a human individual. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture content today. I hope I've been able to give you some sense of the utility, the fun, and for me, the beauty of social theory. It's my specialization. It's what I love. It's what I love to teach. And if you want to talk about it with me, some of you are in tutorials with me or in the online course with me. If not, feel free to get in touch and we can have a conversation about it. I will see all of you in week 4 for the lecture on globalization. And until then, enjoy the content next week.